for coming here this morning. I represent the southernmost part of Florida, the southernmost district, and I believe one of the most beautiful areas, the Florida Keys and parts of Miami-Dade County. And we are definitely ground zero for climate change. And so this hearing, if we can't make advances on ensuring that we have these regulations for our federal buildings, then we won't be able to expect the same investments in commercial and private facilities as well. So I wanted to ask you, Ms. Beardsley, last year, the National Defense Authorization Act required the Department of Defense to assess the flood risk of its facilities and to mitigate those risks. But other non-DoD facilities are not included in this requirement. And I'm concerned about the resiliency of essential federal buildings after hurricanes, specifically, and floods. Buildings that house very important services for my constituents and constituents all over the United States. Do you think that we need to establish a federal flood risk management standard for all federal buildings and infrastructure?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Yes, we would agree that such a standard would be helpful to ensure that there's baseline protection of federal investment as well as life and property across the board.
And so since Mr. Meadows was bringing that up, that different buildings should have different requirements, can you expand a little bit on that? I'd like for you to comment on the questions that he was asking.
Mm-hmm. So as I mentioned, the LEED system does have flexibility and needs to account for what the conditions are facing that building, the climate zone. And I'll note we also do reference the ASHRAE 90.1 system, which an energy model and energy requirements are based on the climate. With respect to the floodplain, this is where consideration of changing conditions is important, where existing maps may not reflect the conditions that the building will face over its lifetime of 60, 80, 100 years.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, and I know that you attended the Paris climate meetings and the talks, do you think that there are any specific policies from other countries that you would suggest we consider here in the United States that we should implement, especially as it pertains to government infrastructure, buildings, facilities?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. The Paris Climate Conference was really quite exciting and a remarkable moment in time. And what we've seen since then is a movement from these high-level commitments towards more action by the countries who are party to the agreement. Some of the key areas that we're seeing action on relating to buildings include commitments to net zero energy buildings and also interest in net zero carbon buildings. For example, the EU has a directive requiring all new public buildings to be nearly zero energy buildings, and all new buildings, including private, by 2030. Japan has some analogous requirements as well, and some countries are also providing financial incentives to move towards zero energy buildings.
So it is possible. Mm-hmm. We can do this. Mm-hmm.
We would agree. Yes.
Thank you. Sorry, I realized I have an extra minute. I wanted to ask a quick question of Mr. Russell. What has been your experience working with the GSA, and what have been the chief obstacles that the GSA or other agencies have faced in pursuing Green Globe certification?
I've greatly enjoyed working with the GSA. I use a number of the GSA resources, such as the SF Tool website, and, to provide education to our various clients, various project teams on really good sources of where you can find good materials, what are good methods, different techniques they can do to help make the projects more sustainable. And so I really haven't had much of a problem in working with GSA. As far as obstacles, the biggest thing is probably more familiarity working with Green Globes and recognizing that we're a viable option out there, and to recognize that it's a great resource to consider.
Thank you, Mr. Russell. I yield back my time.